Hi, so welcome. I'm really excited today to have Exulansic with me, who is a very famous YouTuber and in fact has her own incredibly popular channel, which is not only on YouTube, in fact, it's on Rumble, Odyssey, and in fact, you even lost your channel at one point, didn't you? And basically, you're on all platforms, and you're the queen of the technical takedown. And you're also a highly qualified speech and language therapist. Is that correct, Exulansic?
Yeah, yeah, that's all more or less correct. So,
And,
yep.
and we're basically meeting across time zones, and you're based in the States. So you're very, very welcome. And thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today. It's really
Yeah, thank
kind of
you.
you.
I'm really
Um,
looking forward to it.
awesome. One of the things I wanted to quiz you on basically is your experience, your personal experience of autism, because you have a number of things to bring to the table here. You were a detransitioner slash desister, but you also have a lifetime's experience of having autism. So I wondered if we could sort of talk about some of those, because for a period of time you identified as a trans man. And one of the things I thought would be interesting for us to do, because I want to try and kind of unpack this a little bit more for the people who kind of watch this channel, is thinking about this both personally, because I've been quite open about having autism myself, but also from a macro kind of analytical perspective. So maybe you could kind of introduce us a little bit to your backstory.
Yeah, I was not a typically developing child, so I skipped some things. Like I didn't really crawl. I just went straight from sitting to walking, and so that's often a sign of a developmental difference that predicts problems later. I learned how to read aloud very young, much younger than you're supposed to be able to do that. I think I was about 2, and that also predicts problems later because you're learning to read in a very inefficient way. Um, so it makes it more difficult to read for depth later. Um, and yeah, so I had all these kind of early prodigious advanced abilities, and then later I got into school and got into social interactions and found that there was a bit of a problem. It was a there was a lot of friction, and so at that point, my parents started to try to bring me to different people to figure out like what's actually going on here. Um, and what we were told at the time, because it was the old DSM, was that because I had met my milestones early and not late, and because I could do all these tasks, that I wasn't autistic, because the old category system had autism, but it also had Asperger's syndrome and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, meaning something's going on, but it's not clear enough. It's not coherent enough for it to be its own category. So we're just going to put you in this one. Um, all of those categories were merged with autism in the 2013 DSM update, which basically means that now autism is the name for a pervasive developmental disorder, and
Mm.
it's not a subcategory of that category. So I didn't find that out until like last year, when a bunch of people like saw me on the talking about autism on my, what was it, trigonometry interview,
Mhm.
and some people emailed me and were like, why are you talking about this category like you're not in it? And so we had an exchange, and I was updated to the update.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, so I had some. I also was diagnosed with sensory integration disorder, which is like secondary to pervasive developmental issues. And so I had therapy for that for I think about a year. I probably would have benefited from more therapy earlier, but they didn't have as much recognition of the category and the presentation, I guess, as they do today.
Mm.
It's
I mean,
it's yeah.
well, this is one of the reasons that I wanted to speak to you. Not only because, well, we obviously we did meet before briefly in Brighton at Standing for Women, but um, because you're obviously brilliant at kind of identifying a lot of the technical aspects of that are going on in gender wars. But I think one of the things that's going on in terms of the epidemiology of the young population is that we've got this kind of emergency in this particularly autistic population. And one of the things that's been particularly bothersome for me is the fact that I don't think we're giving enough attention to this, which is one of the reasons I wanted to sort of quiz you, really, because I think that you and I have some specialist knowledge in terms of our personal backstory. And I think that this is one of the things that I find is particularly pertinent when I read a lot of the academic literature and the policy documents, and every time I seek bits of information, obviously people are trying to apply autism information across a really incredibly complex and diverse group, and that's very difficult to do. In fact, I saw something today from Az Hakim, who's a psychiatrist in the UK, who I'm sure you know, and he said that he thought that from his male patients, that he thought 100% of his male patients were in fact on the autistic spectrum, which I thought was a staggering amount, and that somewhat less in his female population. So I wanted to maybe talk to you specifically about how this interacted with gender dysphoria, and how these two things kind of related to your backstory. How did that work out for you? How did that all sort of happen?
So I talked about this a lot in my speech at the Detrans Awareness in Sacramento, which is on YouTube. But there's kind of two main facets of autism, and one would be the sensory developmental difference, and the other is social pragmatic difference. And so I believe that the social differences stem in part from the fact that you're on a different developmental path, and so you don't relate to other people because they are fundamentally different from you. But also that you lack a model of social interactions. So that I think some people want to try to normalize autism as being like, well, you're just different, but the difference is equal to the other difference. I don't think that they're on equal footing, because there's a lack of understanding there that gives rise to the differences that other people don't have. They don't lack that understanding, and it is possible to gain that understanding over time with help. So and it doesn't mean that you'll stop being different in some ways, but there is a lack of a model that gives rise to some of the social errors, and that can be treated. Interventions can happen, and I don't want people to think, well, there's no point in trying to learn that, because there is a point to trying to learn that. It will make your life a lot easier if you learn that. An aspect of that, though, is that you're not understanding why all these stories about especially male and female interactions, as it's presented culturally, why they unfold the way that they do. If you're a female, especially, you may be being asked to do things that are very difficult for you to do. So I did a makeup tutorial recently on YouTube, and well, a lot of people were very nice about it. And I prefaced it with, like, I'm not the best at this task. I still had some people being like, do you know you have fine motor problems? Yes, I do. But like, it's hard. It's not something where practice makes it better that much, because it's related to disability. It's like my handwriting is god awful, but I can type 140 words a minute. Like I have skills and deficits that follow a specific pattern that can be explained, and the explanation for the typing speed is that I'm not having to sustain my attention. I'm not having to do a fine motor task, really. It's like one finger at a time, it presses it, and then there's instant feedback. So I can learn complex patterns that way without having to coordinate a whole freaking hand, especially just one hand at a time. Like, handwriting is really hard.
So when because I have a problem with the concept of gender dysphoria, which is kind of a much of a bigger sort of conversation, really. And one of the things that I think is problematic in terms of how it relates to autism is in and of itself, there is a whole diagnostic overshadowing, because a lot of the mental health components that relate to gender dysphoria actually stand in isolation and live within the autistic kind of mental health framework, if you like. So I think it's incredibly difficult to remove them and isolate them and say, yes, they actually just relate to the issue of gender, even though I'm not, that's another issue I'm not going to get into in this question. But so when you were young, or whenever this started for you, what was your kind of, what was your mental health like when you kind of went, yeah, this is the issue, that is a gender issue, or was it like more of an autism issue? If you look back now and think, where did this start for you?
I so when I was a child, like I had a lot of anxiety that, for instance, that people wouldn't be able to tell that I was a girl for some reason. But I also had a lot of fear and anxiety surrounding the fact that people would have expectations put on me just because I was a girl. And I kind of, that got reinforced in school, like in middle school, for instance. I got called, like, the other kids and this is at a Christian school, in the classroom would just call me man, and then my last name unfortunately rhymes with the word queer, so I got called that a lot. So it was kind of just like I didn't, and I wanted to I was preoccupied with proving that I was as strong as a boy and equal to boys, and I really didn't like any situation where I had to be dressed up as in cultural clothing typical for girls. I didn't
And
understand makeup at all, as I mentioned, and any kind of like, yeah.
Was that a sensory kind of issue, or was that just that they were?
It was sensory and social. I didn't
Right.
like how other people were looking at me and what I thought that they were looking at. I had a lot of anxiety as I went through puberty and had to transition to looking like a woman rather than being a child, and all of the attention that drew really stressed me out. The
Did you
pressures of trying to people expecting me to start dating, didn't like.
Right. And I suppose at some point you had some form of, when your sort of sexuality awakening sort of happened, that kind of fed into that.
Yeah, I just wanted to not interact.
But you ended up doing queer theory or women's studies.
Yeah, when I went to college, I really wanted to study women's studies because I wanted to study women and the status of women, and like women as a coherent, like biologically based category that I was a part of. And then at that point, I was exposed to gender theory because women's studies had become gender and women's studies, because you can't just study women. We have to study femininity. We can never be free of that attachment. We can't just study women as women. So I had to take classes on that. That one of the core classes was advanced feminist theory, and advanced feminist theory it was just gender theory. It wasn't really feminist theory, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so it was reading books that were written by members of the faculty in that department that had been inspired by Judith Butler, who's not in the women's studies department, not in the gender studies department, not in the linguistics department. She's in the rhetoric department, and the rhetoric, and her whole position, like the thing that she's famous for is an attempt to apply a linguistics concept of performativity to gender studies and women's studies. And so it's just absurd to me that she's, I don't know. I don't think that she quite understands the concept of a performative.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a lot of sense as applied to gender.
I think we could blow our own heads up if we stayed too long on the issue of Judith Butler, don't you think? I was wanting to quiz you a little bit on the issue of mental health more generally, and how young women develop a sense of self, because I think this is a really problematic area for, when adolescent girls go through that kind of period of self-development, because I think that's really a difficult thing for autistic young women. And I think that one of the things, I think the roads that girls are going down at the moment, which leads them down the trajectory of manning, is this because they spend so much time mirroring and masking and trying to copy and find role models and trying out new identities, because they emulate, they copy, they covet what they see. And that non-autistic girls don't do this like autistic women do. And I think the other point at the intersection where autism crosses over with borderline personality disorder is an interesting dimension to this, where there's this kind of point at which you have this women, girls, or where they've got mental health problems, being diagnosed having BPD when they're actually have autism, and they're self-harming, and they've got suicidality, or they've got other mental health problems. Because this is what a lot of parents come to me with, because they've got ROGD kids.
Right.
So I kind of wanted to ask
it's shocking to me when teenage girls are diagnosed with personality disorders when their personalities haven't even been done forming and developing yet. They're already being pathologized. But that's outside of my area, obviously, but I do think that there's kind of a lack of understanding that if somebody has social pragmatic language deficit from autism, it would naturally give rise to anxieties about that stem from not knowing which attachments are secure and which attachments can be relied on, and not knowing who to trust, and having repeated experiences with trusting the wrong people. So I feel like there's a there's kind of an urge to stigmatize it without fully understanding or explaining it.
When you went down your kind of pathway, at what point did you think this is not me, I've kind of taken the wrong direction, and I've made a mistake? What was the kind of awakening?
I kind of stopped. So I got into it around 2009, which was shortly after I took the Judith Butler class. Not from Judith Butler either. It was from just her fans. And I was involved with it. One of the first sense that this was a bad thing was when someone quite close to me got her top surgery, and I was there in the immediate aftermath, and it just was kind of a wake up call that, like, what are we doing? What is this? Like, to see a tube coming out of her chest and going to a blood bag that didn't need to be there medically, and knowing that she, and then seeing the aftermath and other people too, just kind of seeing that, like, it's one thing to be theoretical and to be trying to perform gender and play around with that in a way, but to actually be cutting off body parts, it just felt like we're being taken advantage of. Like, this is actually not a good thing. And then I changed schools because I was going to graduate school now, and I was just not surrounded by other people who were steeped in that, so it just, for that reason, stopped feeling important. I got out of that environment. So it's like, if you have a child that's really deep in it, that's something to consider as a solution, is to really just fundamentally change the environment. And then they can see how unimportant it might actually be. And I started getting, I'd already been in therapy, but I started getting more intensive therapy. Or maybe not quite then, but I did have a therapist that I feel like was really good. And so she just kind of made a lot of space for me to talk about a lot of things. So I could hear myself talking about them, which I think is how therapy really works in some ways, is to allow you to talk out loud. And so there's an over connectivity, under connectivity theory of autism, which is that different brain areas, like within a processing area, are overconnected, so you can get these like really high level like sensory perceptivity, because you just have a high pixel density inside of the processing areas, but the processing areas themselves are not very well connected to each other, so they're not very well integrated. So by talking about what you're feeling out loud, you're actually allowing connections to form between processing areas that are underconnected. So I think that helped me. And then just over time, I got my anxiety treated finally. So I stopped having as much issues. I've talked about in other videos about having a history of agoraphobia. And I definitely will still have that tendency if I don't like stay on top of it. If too much time goes past without tending to that tendency, I'll start to notice that it's starting to. I seem to be avoiding leaving the house again. So, but it's never been as bad as it was before I got any treatment. But I realized that the whole dressing up as a man was kind of a way to feel confident going outside and to feel safe. And so I just didn't need to do that anymore to achieve the same level of comfort. So it stopped being important. And I started just kind of realizing that, like, okay, this was a way of coping with deeper issues that had not yet been identified and resolved. So
what sort of concerns have you developed? Because you're somewhat of an expert, really, within the kind of gender critical movement. I mean, what sort of concerns have you got about this population in terms of how badly affected they've been and their vulnerability? And what are your sort of thoughts about what we should be doing to try and safeguard them and put some provision in place to stop this? Because essentially what I'm finding, and this is my major cards on the table, autism charities, celebrities, YouTubers, TikTok stars, social media, everything that a young person might look to in order to role model, are basically promoting an affirmation only model to young autistic males and females. So what's your kind of thoughts about how we can go about changing this?
That's such a big question. It's I really just think that they're being taken advantage of by people who should know better, but perhaps that they don't have a good model of what it means to have a deficient model of social interactions. And so, or they do understand that and they're just taking advantage of it. I saw something recently where it was saying that some trans experts or gender experts were saying that we can get consent from a nonverbal autistic child, because we're doing this to children, for transitioning by having them draw a picture of what gender they think they are. And it was just the most absurd thing. Like that's how could you possibly know that they understood the question? It's just exploitative. And so I think that there's a lot of these kids, they don't, and I've tried interacting with some of them, and they didn't like that, but they don't understand what it means. They don't really understand the implications of the fact that they have a social language disorder. They don't get it. And so if you try to explain it, they just will get frustrated and mad and think that you're trying to put them down in some way. But fundamentally, they when you're autistic, when you have a social or a sensory delay, then that can affect the development of play skills. And so you can get stuck in the sensory motor level of development in terms of your play. And then the gender scientists come along and say, well, imagine that you're the opposite sex and then go interact with other people who are imagining that they're the opposite sex. Well, that's like kind of like play therapy. That's trying to get you into the next stage of play development. And they don't have insight into that. And so it feels like it's real to them because they haven't spent enough time doing it so that they could actually mature past it. So I feel like that it did serve a bit of a function for me, also social developmental wise, play development wise, to basically LARP, live action role play. Like,
Mm.
I'm going to be a man, you're going to be a woman, and we're going to act this out. We're going to have a good time playing together. And so I don't know what sort of safeguarding we really need beyond, just stopping this. Like the idea that it's ever a good idea to disrupt normal, healthy development for a cosmetic reason in a child. It's just never going to be okay with what's going on, whether they're autistic or not. So
Mm.
I
I think one of the things which I think is incredibly important that I see and I have experienced throughout my life is, and I think that this is why they're running together to find solace in groups, is that basically because their social interactions are failing at the first hurdle, and they're shunned often socially, which is a kind of classic autistic problem. I mean, I find it myself all the time. But obviously, as you get older, you become more robust at dealing with that, and you don't care as much. You just care, you kind of off a little bit more. But obviously, when you're younger, that is incredibly hurtful and difficult. So obviously, they're norming and forming together in subgroups. So essentially, they're just small pockets of autistic groups all forming together. And I think that one of the things that I find within the gender critical movement is that whilst people talk about caring about people with autism, they only really care to a very superficial level, and they're not actually developing their interests beyond anything more than a small level, a very minor level. And what I'd really like to see is them really pushing and arguing for some real research, some real bodies of work to be done, and championing, like they have got behind LGB, which I fully support. And obviously, a lot of these autistic people are also LGB, but I'd like them to be really hammering on the doors of the social scientists and supporting them financially, and MPs, etc., and saying we need to do more for autism. These kids are autistic. We need to study them and what their needs are, because what I'm seeing from autism experts on YouTube, for example, and in policy documents and academic documents is horrific. I mean, it's really bad. It's so superficial. The other thing I wanted to just draw you on, because this is again something I enjoy a lot about your videos. We've gone from it's the embodiment goals. Okay, we've gone past this is like a serious we're really struggling. If gender dysphoria is a serious issue, but essentially just it's a lifestyle choice now, isn't it? These are embodiment goals now.
You don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans, is the idea now.
Right.
So anybody can join the club, and this is how you prove that you're part of the club. You might have your breasts removed, you might have your nipples removed. There's a YouTuber I've responded to a couple times. Or not YouTuber, she's on TikTok. Previously Gwen B. Short, now it's Archie B. Short. This is the one who had her breasts removed, had her nipples removed, and then made a few posts about how she had this like constant sensation that her nipples were being like twisted. And she had the nipples removed because she didn't think that she would be able to stomach the healing process. She thought that the healing process would make her nauseous, and she has the sensory sensitivity from being autistic.
Right.
How is it going to affect your sensory sensitivity, her overload, sensory overload, to have a long-term perpetual purple nurple? So I just feel like she was taken advantage of by a doctor that wanted to increase the profit margin at the surgery, and talked into thinking, well, 6 weeks of a sensory difference or sensory stimulation is too much. So make this choice. But she's not because of her disability, it's difficult for her to really think long term and to really exercise good judgment. And so now she's stuck with this constant sensation that she can't really address. And she's not the only one that I've found that ended up with this. So there's another one too, who has made videos showing how she basically tries to mirror box her own her nipples that are no longer there. So she'll go stand in front of a mirror and she'll pretend to stimulate where they would have been in order to cope with the fact that they hurt. They hurt
Mm.
now because they got amputated for no reason as a
Mm.
fashion choice. Because if you're saying that you're not doing it for gender dysphoria reasons, you're saying that I don't have a mental illness. I'm just doing it to because I want to be part. Like, it's fashion, and it's going to
Mm.
go out of fashion eventually. And then where will
Mm.
they be?
Mm. I mean, essentially, a lot of those girls are just choosing non-binary because, of course, they're being presented with this idea that they're not Barbie or Ken, so they must be in the middle, and they are essentially,
And
obviously,
that's literally what they're presented with too, like
yeah,
Barbie and GI Joe spectrum.
yeah,
I saw that for the first time when I was at San Jose State. They had that up in the LGBT center.
mm,
There was also directing people to the testosterone truck that came around. You get
mm,
your prescription. You had to go fill it at a real pharmacy, but you could get it there.
mm. Yeah, no, they are teaching that in schools in the UK. And the other thing, that if a young person is looking on YouTube, for example, and they come across some of the doctors who are talking about autism or gender identity, they'll find information that says, if you have autism, you should definitely get checked for gender identity issues, and if you have gender identity issues, you should definitely get checked for autism. It's just synonymous now.
Yeah,
Um, and this is something which is just really seriously disturbs me. So it just feels very Mengele. We're just experimenting, and it's eugenics on autistic people. So
yeah, it's
I want
absolutely
more.
eugenics.
Yeah,
They're
I
they're,
just want
they're
more.
getting people to volunteer.
I want more screaming about it, basically.
Yeah, and then they're of course lying to them and saying that these interventions can be reversed. As you know, one way I try to explain it is like, okay, you're driving on a highway and you veer off into the water. You can't just reverse out of that. You hit a tree. I mean, you could try to reverse, but it's not going to be the same as if you didn't hit the tree.
Mm,
It's you are causing damage that is not reversible.
mm,
Like, and also there's no reversing time. You can't pause time, you can't reverse time. You will continue going forward, which means that you will always be somebody who spent a period of time on that drug and it had effects. It's not reversible in that way. And it's also disrupting hormones that we know have important developmental neurological impact that act across the lifespan to maintain your neurology. We know that if they become dysregulated later in life, that's associated with diseases like Alzheimer's. So and they're just stopping it. And some people, they're trying to petition to stay on puberty blockers past 18 because, like, long term. So we're having people who are having their development stunted. They're given some of these cross-sex hormones way downstream after all these other hormones get disrupted that are important for your neurological development. In people who have a pervasive developmental disorder, so they're already not typically developing, and we're going to stunt them further, and just give them the cosmetic ones that are at the end of the line so that they look like they went through a puberty, but they didn't actually get to go through puberty, which means they didn't actually develop in the same way. And so you get people like Jazz Jennings saying, even before the surgery, like, I've never had sexual function. I don't have any sexual sensation. So we're getting people who are being stunted and into having the minds of children, and not just any children either. A lot of times children who already had a developmental delay in certain areas, like social language, and who are then old enough, to otherwise consent later eventually, and then given hormones to look like they went through a development. We're setting them up to be extremely vulnerable to
mm,
being exploited, at the same time that the different states are making it so that, if a parent doesn't affirm the child can run away and go live with someone they met on the internet,
mm,
and who can then take custody. I think that Washington is trying to come up with like temporary, like, foster situations for such people.
mm,
And it's and such people who then can help them change their physical appearance, change their name, and change their documents. So, once somebody gets sucked into that, how do they get back? How do they you know it's
mm,
we're just pretending that sex trafficking doesn't exist. And it's
mm.
it's it's mind-blowing to me.
Mm. I don't know that much about the provision for mental health support in the US, but in terms of the UK, there is very poor mental health support for autistic people um, after diagnosis from a very young age and onwards. And so we have this thing called CAMS, which is a sort of child and adolescent mental health service, which is not well liked and deals with literally everything. But I think one of the problems that is often found by this kind of population is that they are often struggling incredibly with all sorts which come along with the package of autism. Which are all these comorbid issues around OCD and anxiety and depression and suicidality and these emptiness and this, these issues. And I think that it's very underappreciated. I don't think people fully appreciate how difficult it is to live in this parallel universe because I don't think it's described that well. And talked about that much because it is certainly in some of the people who I know, they do really struggle to live in this other existence that is different to, the kind of norms. And I suspect that this contributes greatly to why a lot of these youngsters are also forming bonds and joining together, because it really is the way that they can form some, type of support. And unfortunately, this has incredibly negative medical and surgical consequences, at which point they're, often really car crashing their bodies, because a lot of the detransitioners really all do seem to be on the spectrum, from what I can see.
Yeah, there's I think there's a concept of masking that is being popularized, and the idea being that if you have a social pragmatic deficit and you don't understand why conversations evolve the way they do, but you're bright, you can learn to fake it by watching other people's conversations, but faking it leaves you feeling very empty because you don't really I mean, it's fatiguing, it's inefficient. It's like I mentioned, my reading style was previously quite inefficient, and therefore when I got to novels, it was really hard for me to process the information on a deep level at the same time I was reading it. So it's like it was very superficial capacity to read. It just made it difficult, and it's like I still actually kind of struggle with that today. It's much more accessible for me to listen to audiobooks, for instance, because that deep processing is present in the auditory modality. But for reasons crossing the midline, for instance, is an idea in developmental delay. So when you read, you're having to cross the midline and integrate two hemispheres of your brain at once, and it's for reasons. There's reasons it's more challenging for some people. But if you go back to the conversational kind of masking, if you don't understand how your own emotions are supposed to play into having a conversation, if it's difficult for you to process the social aspect of it at the same time as you're talking and listening, but you know how it's supposed to look, so you start to fake it based on how you think other people want you to talk, or what other people expect from you. That does leave you very vulnerable to going along with things that maybe on some level you also know that you shouldn't be going along with. Like you get a ping that like this is dangerous, but you can't explain why. And you don't want to go against other people's expectations because you've been so very conditioned that this is the way to have a successful conversation, is to just keep going along with their expectations. It really leaves you vulnerable for very manipulative and dangerous personalities. And
so
I think
in
that's the situation we're in.
ways, so many
because
ways.
when you're only affirming, that's the message you're sending to the young person is, I expect you to keep being trans. That's the way to have a successful conversation, is to keep explaining how you want to be trans. That good job, you're doing it, you're doing the right thing, keep taking steps along this path. And it's a complete failure or refusal, whether deliberate or inadvertent, to recognize the role that the clinician and the parent is playing in the child's behavior. It's a complete emotional abandonment, in my opinion, of the person, especially a person with autism who doesn't understand the larger social fabric that they're existing in, especially when they're young.
I think one of the things, I mean, there's so many things that frustrate me about the. For instance, there was a committee meeting about relationships and sex education that went on this week in our parliament, which was particularly problematic for a whole number of reasons. But one of the things that they don't do is make any consideration about people who've got any different needs of any way. They say that they do, but they do not, they don't delineate in any shape or form. No support is offered, no support. And in terms of the school system, I think that I'd really like some real attention to be paid to this. I'm not sure how we can go about it, but if any parents find us, if any young people find this video and they find that we've had a chat about it and it gives them any kind of solace, some kind of like, oh, that resonated, then at least we might have made a tiny bit of difference. And in some way, that can be that's a good thing.
That made me think also that there's thought to be a somewhat high comorbidity of autism and seizure disorders, for instance. Right. And but just in general, even without that, there's can be a high sensitivity to your own emotional shifts. And so a lot of behaviors that are stereotypical of autism are associated with transitions and avoiding transitions. And conversation is one long series of emotional transitions. My turn, your turn. That's an emotional transition, and sometimes people don't want to let go of their turn, and they or they fear it becoming their turn again. So there's not and they will. Sorry, there's a truck going by. There's a lack of recognition of those that these behaviors that you're seeing, such as going along to get along pathologically, or dominating the conversation with a preferred topic, such as gender, that those are behaviors that are about avoiding certain unpleasant experiences. Throwing a tantrum when it's time to give the iPad back, it's behavior that's avoiding having a particularly unpleasant experience. So it's just they're not getting the help that they need to learn their own patterns, so that those patterns cannot be manipulated by a predatory person or an exploitive person. Instead, we're coaching them and affirming them when they do the behavior that we want, which is to ask for more surgeries and hormones, and to when they express fear about going through puberty, instead of helping them get ready for this big transition that's coming up, we tell them, oh, wow, you're right. Puberty is extra bad for you. Puberty will cause you to want to die. You're right. Good job. Good job figuring out that you need to completely avoid puberty, and here's drugs to do it. It's criminal.
It's beyond bonkers to say that we should encourage you to shorten your life, for you to take a healthy body and become a lifelong medical patient and completely mess yourself up, basically.
And the trans men are on board with that too. It's like they're not even in denial that it's going to shorten their life. They're like, well, yeah, but men live shorter, so I'm a man, so it's okay that I'll die sooner. And it's like, you are not thinking about life. You are not exercising good judgment if you're signing up for that. And it's I've had trans men be like, I have a video where I react to one of them saying this to me on TikTok. That one, they would rather live one good day as the gender they are than to have another 30 years in the wrong body or whatever. And it's like, this person was like probably 22. So it's just it's complete fantasy when they talk about what they would prefer long term. And any grown person, any person who's had a brain that fully developed, whether it was had a pervasive developmental disorder or not, if you've managed to get to the top of the mountain somehow, whether through the correct interventions, or just luck or whatever, you understand that when you were young, you thought you were immortal, and any discussion of what you would want in 30 or 40 years was based on fantasy and not based on the experience of being alive a long enough time. And so it's yeah.
And I think some of them are would actually believe that when they think they're a trans man, they genuinely would believe that they will turn into being a man, because their
Yeah.
theory of mind is such that they think it is. And I think that's the other reason why they feel that their misgendering is literal violence. It genuinely is a violent incident, because they are so fundamentally offended by it, because they believe they are so
They're
invested in
so
the black and
sensitive
white.
to their own emotions.
Right,
When they get misgendered, that represents disappointment, because they had
right.
an expectation that other people would gender them correctly, and then that didn't happen. And so it
Mm,
triggers their disappointment. And it also makes them aware that other people are different from them and they can't control other people. And
mm,
it just the people who are that profoundly affected, it's very obvious to me that there's a social development delay that's completely
mm,
independent of their intellectual development and their language development, which is how
mm,
autism goes. You have the typical progression where things track and develop in a particular order, a particular time. You have
mm,
that development, but delayed. And then you have autism, where you have some things are really far ahead, way earlier than they should, and some things are just stalled for
mm.
whatever reason. So,
Which,
so
which,
I, yeah.
which is another reason why I tried to explain a little bit about alexithymia,
Mm,
and why I think that is is worth knowing about for some people.
mm,
Because there are other things like aphantasia, alexithymia, interoception. There's all these other things that sort of run alongside. But I do think alexithymia in a lot of these groups, the amount of parents I come who say, they're upstairs, I can't speak to them. When I ask them how they feel, they just go, I don't know. And I
right.
say, that's probably because they actually don't know how they feel. They actually don't have the capacity to explain it. And then
Yeah,
when I
that's
try
part of the
to,
social pragmatic deficit, is that
right,
you don't know how to answer other people's questions like that.
right,
You don't when you have a language deficit, and social pragmatics is a kind of language delay, the language deficit, that includes your ability to interpret your own internal sensations and into behavior and words
mm,
broadly.
mm,
And so they really need a very specialized kind of therapy to learn how to describe their own emotions. They need to work with somebody that can see their emotions very sensitively, and then can tell them in a way that they can listen, that they can hear.
mm,
But you do need, like, they they're not going to learn it socially. They need
mm,
to be told what they're feeling by somebody that can actually feel what they're feeling,
mm,
i.e., a skilled social language therapist, because they're not going to figure it out from watching other people, because that is just not how their brain works.
mm,
Like, they're not going to generalize, but once they can learn to label it, then they can start to verbally reason about their own feelings and respond more appropriately to them, rather than just kind of respond in the desperate way that's more typical of, more stereotypical of autism and meltdowns,
mm.
where they don't know how to respond to these emotions and make them stop, and it's just overwhelming. um, but it's
Well,
something that can be treated.
well, I have really, really enjoyed chatting to you, and I better let you go and get some work done and get some jobs on. And I'm so grateful for you to making the time to come and chat to me. And it's been just fab. So thank you so much,
Yeah,
Exulansic. And
thank you.
I'll put your channel up so that people, if they don't know you, they can go and find you. And yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you, I had a great time.